Hello everyone, this is Matthew Jenner for Card Runners, and I'm here with the theory behind advanced bet sizing, part 2. I want to quickly go over the outline for this video. First, we're going to finish explaining basic bet sizing theory. We're almost done with this, so if you haven't seen the first video in this series, you definitely want to watch that before this one. It should be a video that came out a few weeks before this one, not the very old bet sizing theory. It should be the one released a few weeks before this one. And we're going to go into more detail on advanced bet sizing theory. We're going to get very comfortable with when to use ascending bet sizing, descending bet sizing, and equal fractions on each street. And we're going to start balancing multiple bet sizing ranges in the same spot. So we've got a lot to do today. So picking up from where we left off, why can't we overbet on dry boards? Well, we can at least sometimes. We'll probably get into that later though. But it's a bit different and not nearly as effective for two reasons. The first is you don't need to deny your opponent the ability to realize his equity. Overbetting kings on a queen 7-3 rainbow flop isn't as useful as overbetting queens on a 10 of hearts, 8 of hearts, 3 of diamonds, 2 of diamonds turn. You can see right here, if you have a hand like pocket kings on a queen 7-3 rainbow flop, you're not really very vulnerable to any hands in your opponent's folding range. He's probably not going to fold his gut shots. He's probably not going to fold his pairs. So when you or most of his pairs. So when you overbet kings, you're not really making any hands fold that are that threatening, so you're not really preventing your opponent from being able to realize his equity that effectively. Whereas when you overbet queens on a 10 of hearts, 8 of hearts, 3 of diamonds, 2 of diamonds turn, you're likely going to make them fold some flush draws, some straight draws, some overcards, a bunch of 5-out pair hands that queens are quite vulnerable to. So overbetting just makes sense on wet boards to make your opponent have a hard time realizing his equity. Number 2, your opponent probably still has nutted hands in his range. If he calls your flop bet on a Jack 7-2 rainbow board, he probably can still have all of his set combos in his range on the turn. This makes overbetting worse since you are beat more often and you want to bet big when you can't be beat. So let's stick with this Jack 7-2 rainbow board for 1 minute. If we bet the flop and our opponent calls and the turn card comes a 4, it's really hard to overbet here with a hand like pocket queens because we're still going to be beat a decent amount of time on the turn. Our opponent's still going to probably have 9 set combos in his range, and he can raise all of those in a bunch of bluffs, so it makes our overbet with queens very ineffective because it sucks if we overbet and then find out we have a bluff catcher. In addition, when we overbet with queens, while we might get a little bit more value from hands like ace-jack, our opponent's probably not going to have to call us down much wider than ace-jack, so we don't really end up getting that much more value from hands we beat because we make hands like king-jack and queen-jack fold, which we wanted value from, and then even though we get a little bit more value from ace-jack, it's overall not going to be worth it because we lost value from king-jack and queen-jack, and then we also just lost more money against hands like pocket 2s and pocket 7s. So overbetting here just isn't that good. It's also important to note that you will still stack your opponent when you have a hand like pocket jacks on a Jack 7-2 rainbow board and he has 2 pair or sets on the turn. You don't need to overbet to stack many of your opponent's very strong hands. So that's something that's going to come up a lot, which is overbetting is very useful when your opponent's not going to have a raising range and you want to get a lot of money in the pot. If your opponent's going to raise very aggressively, overbetting is much less effective because you're going to still stack a bunch of his strong hands anyways. Lastly, we want to keep in mind that when I say dry boards, I don't mean dry in the conventional sense. This is explained in other videos. A board such as 7-3-3 rainbow isn't really a dry board because every hand has around 6 overcards. People usually use the term dry board to illustrate ranges are polarized, but often use boards to illustrate this concept which don't work this way. I got this wrong in the past, live and learn. So most people would consider a board like 7-3-3 incredibly dry, but it doesn't really work the way we want a board to work when we talk about a dry board because ranges aren't super polarized on the 7-3-3 board. In other words, hands like pocket 10s, pocket 9s, pocket 8s, 7x are going to be outdrawn all the time by overcards, so it's almost like there's tons of hands in both players' range that function as sort of like pretty good draws, like ace-queen, ace-king, queen-king, so this doesn't really work that well as a dry board. When we say a dry board, we usually mean a board like Queen 7-3 Rainbow, because that's a board where when someone's value betting the flop, it's very unlikely they're going to be outdrawn because there just aren't many possible overcards when someone's value betting a range of like Queen King and better. So just be very aware of this concept. So now we need to discuss playing a condensed range. Condensed ranges are hard to play, and because of that, people think they've made a mistake when they end up with a condensed range. Nevertheless, we will have to play a condensed range pretty often, and there are some key features about these ranges we should be aware of. The first is the condensed range can be the betting range. This is something that when you talk about sort of abstract theory, this isn't something you're going to talk about very often. You're used to the player that's betting has a range of like strong value hands and air. You're not used to the mostly medium strength range being the betting range, but a condensed range can be the betting range. Betting with a condensed range can make sense on the flop and turn even if our range is very vulnerable to raises. Betting gets value from weaker hands which might check back, and makes the opponent pay to see additional cards with his hands which can outdraw us. This is why betting with a condensed range can make a lot of sense, because you still can say to yourself, well, okay, I have this condensed range, which means I'm usually not going to be the better, but if my opponent only has me beat a small fraction of the time, and he usually has like a lot of weak hands that can outdraw me, then it can still make sense for me to bet, even though once I get raised, I know I'm going to have a bluff catcher. Because overall, my range has more equity than my opponent's, and I want to bet to make him call down with weaker hands, and to deny him the ability to see free cards. If he raises me, I'll deal with that. That can make sense, and that's a concept very few people understand, and it is decently important. When we bet with a condensed range, we will almost always have a bluff catcher against a balanced opponent once he raises. This encourages us to bet small, since if we bet small, we'll overall lose less money for the hand once we face a raise. Because once we face a raise, if our opponent's balance will be indifferent, but he can only raise us so often, and by betting a small amount, we lose less effectively when we get raised. If we're betting a condensed range, our range will usually have much more equity than our opponent's range. This means having a lower bluffing to value betting ratio is less of a problem. So it's important to keep in mind that when we are betting smaller, we give our opponent a better price, so we need to have value hands more often. This isn't usually a problem if we're betting a condensed range, because in order to make betting a condensed range make sense, our range overall needs to have more equity than our opponents for the most part. In other words, we would never bet a condensed range if our opponent had us beat like 40% of the time on the flop, because our range is just way too weak at that point. This is a very tricky concept, so we're going to illustrate it with an example right here. Say the cutoff opens to 2.65 big blinds, and you flatten the small blind, and the flop comes Queen of Hearts, 3 diamonds, 2 clubs. You, like most kids these days, flat pre-flop with Ace Queen off and King Queen. Does donk betting here make sense? So think about this for a moment. The cutoff opened, you flatted in the small blind, and the flop came Queen 3, 2 rainbow. Why do you think it makes sense? Why do you think maybe it doesn't make sense? What are the advantages? What are the disadvantages to having a donk betting range? Well, to be quite blunt, there's no clear answer here. There are too many streets left to act, and ranges aren't near perfectly polarized, so this won't model very accurately. In other words, we can't just find a formula that tells us our answer. But we can still use theory to give us a good idea. Well, we know our cold calling range is a condensed range. It's pretty much capped at ace-queen, but we also can use Poker Stove to see if our range has more equity. So let's go ahead and do that real quickly. Okay, so I plugged both ranges into Flopzilla and into Poker Stove. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to see how much equity does each range have. So Poker Stove can actually give you an answer for that, which is awesome. And right here we see the small blind flatting range has 56.5% equity. That's a lot more equity than the cutoff opening range. But then if we go look at Flopzilla, we can see that, okay, the small blind flatting range only has top pair or worse. It doesn't have any hands better than top pair, because I wouldn't flat with pocket 3s or pocket 2s in the small blind, and I also wouldn't flat with pocket queens, kings, or aces, so my range is capped at ace-queen here. So even though this range has more equity, this range doesn't have its equity distributed where it has as many really, really good hands. If we look at the cutoff open, the cutoff open has less top pair, which makes sense. It has less middle pair because overall this range has less equity, but it has an overpair 66.73% of the time. So if we plug in ace-queen for removal effects, we'll see that when we donk bet here, our range is capped and beaten about 6% of the time. There's no simple formula we can plug in to see is that capped so much that we can't donk bet. My guess is here it's not. My guess is, hey, our small blind flatting range has a lot more equity than our opponent's range. So overall, we can donk bet here, but since we know our range is capped lower than we'd like, so once our opponent does raise with a balanced range, we're always going to have a bluff catcher, it makes sense for us to bet smaller here. You cannot prove whether or not you should donk bet here and exactly what sizing you should make, but hopefully you can see how it makes sense to donk bet here, even though this range, the small blind flat versus cutoff open, is a much more condensed range. You can just imagine ace-queen here, since there's 93 combos, ace-queen just makes up a very large chunk of the range. It's like 13 or 14% of the range is ace-queen. Actually, a little bit less than that, since I actually 3-bet ace-queen suited, so if you were flatting ace-queen suited, you'd have even more top pair, top kicker. A really lot in that case. So just be aware of this. This is a spot where I think it makes sense to donk bet a condensed range, but you can't prove anything. Poker Stove is a very valuable tool once you understand equity well. But people who just post Poker Stove equity and think that shows which range is better usually have very little idea what they're talking about, but Poker Stove does still give you a good at-a-glance amount of information. So, you really need to understand when you're looking at Poker Stove. It will tell you how much equity each range has, but it doesn't tell you how that equity is distributed. So what we just did was we looked at, okay, which range has more nutted hands, what's the overall equity of both hands, and then we use that to kind of paint a picture for what we think makes sense. We know when we bet, we should bet small in this situation. This still effectively denies our opponent free cards with his hands like ace x suited and king x suited, and we lose less if we're raised, and our opponent can only raise us so much. So remember, when we donk bet here, part of the reason why we bet on the flop is to deny our opponent the ability to realize his equity, and the other reason we do it is to get value. Here, when we're donk betting for value with hands like ace queen and queen king, it's not hugely important that we make our opponent fold a bunch of his air, and if we bet small, we won't make him fold a bunch of his air, because we're just not that worried about being outdrawn. Nevertheless, if we do donk bet the flop, and if we keep betting on the turn, it makes it much more difficult for our opponent to effectively play his ace x suited and king x suited hands. I know there's a lot of stuff going on here, but you want to remember, if you check call the flop with sort of king-queen on that board, your opponent's going to have a very easy time double-barreling when he turns flush draws and all that kind of fun stuff, so it is very useful to start applying pressure to your opponent on the flop, because it makes it more difficult for him to realize his equity. Lastly, betting big just results in the opponent felting king-queen flush himself and makes his raises super effective against us. Betting small forces the opponent to call down with the hands we want, like queen x, jacks, and tens, and prevents him from checking back. So if we do donk bet here, we can get all three streets of value, which is going to be awesome when our opponent has like a weak queen or jacks or tens, because he wasn't going to bet all three streets. In addition, we know overbetting here isn't going to be very effective because it just makes him call down with all of his really strong hands, and we don't have, hands that beat really strong hands in our range. So betting small just makes a ton of sense. So I know I've already kind of been doing it, but I wanted to give you my thoughts on this example. We can't prove whether or not to donk bet ace queen or queen king in this spot. So this is more of my theory-supported opinion than pure theory. But my guess is donk betting small here is game theoretically correct, but I would also imagine it's hard to implement and not terribly important EV-wise, though it's also not going to be completely insignificant. So when I say we can donk bet here, I'm of course not saying we need to necessarily donk bet our entire range. I'm just saying donk betting some fraction of the time makes sense here, and I think that's game theoretically correct. If I were playing, I would look at my opponent's stats and think to myself, okay, I know donk betting here likely makes sense here with ace-queen, and if I do it, I should probably bet small. Does this look more effective than check calling or check raising against this guy? So I can see how donk betting small here makes sense. It's something that's going to run through my thought process, but then I'm going to look at his stats and see what I really want to do. If he has a low c-bet and doesn't raise much, donk bet go, 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 go. If he c-bets recklessly and doesn't fold to check raises, then I'm probably going to check raise him with ace-queen, because he still just doesn't have me beat all that often, right? It was 6% of the time on the flop, so he's going to have a hell of a time if I check raise him aggressively and he's c-betting too much. If he c-bets recklessly and triple barrels recklessly, then I'll just check call him, because I'm not that worried about giving free cards. So you can see all three of these options can make sense, and you can easily go either way to exploit your opponent. Knowing theory here allows us to quickly consider a line here, which is likely the best line against a very strong opponent. Without theory, we'd likely quickly check the flop, or if we did bet, make a bad bet size. If I could play now, I would donk bet against an unknown, since I think it's game theoretically optimally correct, and just learn from there on how people respond on my site stakes. So this is one of those things where I don't really have any experience doing it, because it's just theory at this point, but I would probably be trying donk betting a lot against people that I didn't have a great read against, or people that I thought were really solid, because I think it theoretically makes a lot of sense. If I found out people were raising me too much, and then I might just donk bet and call down. If I find out they're raising me too little, then I might donk bet and fold later on, or anywhere in between. So you want to look at someone's stats and pick what you think is the best line, but theory is very useful for getting you on the right track, because here, if I hadn't really thought about this a lot, I'm guessing if I were donk betting here, I would have donk bet too big. Or I would have thought, oh, we can't donk bet here because our range is capped at ace-queen, when it really doesn't look like that's much of a problem if we use a smaller bet sizing. The final newbie slide before we go into much more in-depth stuff. What is the point in betting strongish hands? We've already talked about this a bit, but it's important we understand this extremely well. Why do we bet medium strength or strong hands on the flop? Pause for a moment and think, but you should know the answer quickly. To make high equity hands relative to our hand fold and to get value from weaker hands. Easy enough. Note, we cannot just look at our hand, but we also need to pay attention to our range. Our range determines what we can and cannot do. So, overall, we have to have a good sense of how our range looks, but for the most part, we're still going to be betting the flop with our specific hand, because remember, in theory, we always have to take the most profitable line with our hand at every single point for it to theoretically make sense. So we look at our overall range, and then we look at our overall hand, and with our hand, it should make sense to bet by making high equity hands fold and to get value from weaker hands. So, example, why can we bet ace of diamonds, nine of diamonds out of position on a 9-6-3 flop in a cutoff versus button situation, but not in a 9-6-3 flop in a big blind versus button situation? So, in both cases, we have top pair, top kicker. Why can we probably bet one out of position, but not the other? Even though it's the same hand. Oh, before we go ahead. So, stop and think for a moment. Why can we bet one, but not the other? Well, when we're in the cutoff and we bet ace-9 on a 9-6-3 board, our opponent can't really raise us recklessly because our range isn't capped at all. We can have sets, we can have overpairs, we can have all sorts of fun draws. Whereas if we donk bet from the big blind against the button open, our range is kind of capped on that board texture. It's a board texture where we have a very hard time check calling. It's a board texture where we really don't have any overpairs, so all we have is a couple of sets. So if we end up donk betting a hand like ace-9, we end up becoming very, very vulnerable when our opponent raises us. And then if we start donk betting sets, then our checks get way, way too vulnerable, so that's not going to be effective. So this is a pretty complex example, and we'll talk about it more when we do the out-of-position play videos, where everything will hopefully click. But this is just an example of where I would c-bet ace-9 if I open the cutoff and my opponent flatted in the button, but I would not donk bet ace-9 in the big blind versus button situation because my range is capped too low at that point. So once again, a little bit of a trickier example than I'd like to use right now, but hopefully you can see here how this is meant to showcase why you have to not only pay attention to what your overall range looks like to determine what you can and cannot do, but overall with your specific hand, you should make sure that it's accomplishing either making high equity hands fold relative to your hand or getting value from weaker hands. Why do we bet medium strength or strong hands on the turn? Exact same thing, to make high equity hands fold and to get value from weaker hands. Why do we bet medium strength or strong hands on the river? To get value from weaker hands and to get high equity hands. Wait, that's the key thing. When you're betting the river, you're with a medium or strong hand, you're pretty much only doing it to get value. You're not making high equity hands fold because you're not going to get outdrawn by those high equity hands, right? There's no more cards to come. This is a very significant thing. This allows us to bet smaller. Nay, it sometimes allows us to bet near the perfect sizing relative to our hand strength when we're on the river. The more often we're beat, the smaller we can bet and vice versa on the river because we don't have to worry about our opponent getting to see another card. It is much, much harder to bet very small on the flop and turn because by betting small, we risk letting our opponent peel wide and outdraw us. Hands which want to bet small are usually very vulnerable to being outdrawn, except on the river. So we've talked a bunch about bet sizing already. When do we want to bet really big? When our range is polarized and we're not likely to get raised because, we can bet our very, very strong hands and not worry about running into a better hand. When do we want to bet small? When we want to keep our opponent's range very wide because our hand is usually going to be a value hand when we're betting small because we give our opponent such a good price. But by betting small, we make him felt very wide. The problem with applying that logic on the flop, and it's okay logic to apply, don't get me wrong, but the problem with it is when we bet really, really small, usually the hands that want to bet small are the vulnerable hands. The hands that are like middle-ish pairs. They don't want to bet too big because if they bet too big, they're just going to sort of value cut themselves. But if they bet too small, then the opponent's going to peel super, super wide and you're going to get your middle pair outdrawn all the time. So it's important to note that when we're betting the flop and the turn, we're trying to make high equity hands fold and get value when we bet marginal or strong hands. But on the river, we don't have to worry about our opponent peeling very wide and outdrawing us, so this lets us make very, very small river bets out of position. It's much harder to do that on the flop and the turn, as we'll see. So now we're going to begin our first complex hand example, which is probably going to be about 25 or 30 slides. I'm recording this right now before I finish doing all the slides for it. So, typical cutoff versus button. We open in the cutoff with the following range. I'll show you in a second. And then the opponent calls in the button with this range. I'll show you in a second. and then the flop comes 10 of hearts, 8 of hearts, 5 of clubs. What bet sizing makes sense here? So I'm going to show you all that stuff real quickly, then we're going to talk about bet sizing. So this would be the cutoff open. You can see it on the board texture. You can see the distribution of hands. If you want to pause the screen and look for a minute, by all means, go ahead. And this is the button versus cutoff flat. Pretty normalish range here. I decided to flat pocket jacks and not flat any pocket aces. You can kind of go either way. You can slow play some aces and ace king. You can slow play some jacks. Not a huge deal. This probably looks very similar to what your range looks like. Once again, it's just not a huge deal. It's a very normal, standard looking button versus cutoff flatting range, although a lot of people will have a little bit of differences here. Okay, so now that you have that in mind, we can move on to the next slide. Slide number 2. The first thing we should note is we cannot solve or even model the bet sizing here very accurately. Neither player has a polarized range on the flop. There are still 3 rounds of betting left to act, and we have a ton of stack depth. So there's no nifty models or formulas we can use. I know when I've done Flopzilla videos in the past, I would say like, okay, look at how big your opponent's betting. Ask yourself whether or not you think he can profitably bet any 2 cards, and then based on that, figure out around how wide you need to defend. That wasn't solving the hand, but we had, in my opinion, an amazingly good starting point there. We could see how big the opponent bet on the flop and figure out, okay, well his bluff should probably make a little bit of money, but not too much money. How wide do we need to defend to not let our opponent c-bet recklessly, yet still have some incentive to c-bet bluff the right types of hands? So we had a really good starting point there. If I were to say, where's your starting point for bet sizing here? There really isn't one, right? You have to understand a whole bunch of stuff really well to even begin to approach this problem, which is what we're going to do, but there's no super clear starting point where you can just jump right in. In this spot, I do not think we should bet very small with any hands or very big with any hands. Why? Pause for a moment and think. I'm going to explain it in the next few slides. So I've already told you what I think is the answer here. You don't have an overbetting range and you don't have a small betting range. I'm going to explain it in a whole bunch of detail over the next several slides, but first see if you can sort of get it for yourself. Why do I not think overbetting is good here? Why do I not think betting small is good here? Make a guess if you don't know. Okay, so, slide number 3. Why shouldn't we overbet? Well, our opponent has us beat even when we hold an overpair on this flop 7.5% of the time. Let's go ahead and look real quickly. So here's the button flatting range, and an overpair or better, so 2 pair plus is 7.55%. So yeah, overpairs are going to be beat here decently often on the flop. The other thing to remember is this does not mean we'll be beat 7.5% of the time on the river after going bet, bet, bet. We'll be beaten more often on this board texture since overpairs will be outdrawn quite often. So even if our opponent has us only beat 7.5% of the time on the flop, this is a board where position is extremely valuable, and overpairs are going to get outdrawn by the river all of the time. Yet overpairs aren't very likely to outdraw a hand that already has the overpair beat on the flop. So for example, if our opponent has pocket 5s, so he has bottom set, and we have pocket kings on the flop, we're not going to outdraw him. But if we have pocket queens on the flop and our opponent has a flush draw, a straight draw, all sorts of pairs with 5 outs, we're going to get outdrawn all of the time. So you don't just look at how often you're beat on the flop, you also have to think how often you're going to be beat by the turn in the river, and you're just going to be beat here all the time. So by overbetting an overpair, it's not going to be very effective. In addition, if we have our opponent coolered, we're going to stack him anyways. Remember, this is a really big factor to think about when debating whether or not you want to overbet. If we overset our opponent on the flop, we're going to stack him no matter what aggressive line we take on the flop. Whether or not we make an average bet size, whether or not we make an overbet, whether or not we make a small bet, whether or not we check raise, they all will end up stacking him by the river. Our opponent has a raising range on this flop. It clearly makes sense for him to have a raising range because he doesn't want to let us realize all of our equity with all of our bluffs. Since we're bluffing a ton of flush draws, straight draws, and gut shots and overcards. So because he's going to have a raising range on this flop, we can say, you know what, if we do have him coolered, we're going to stack him no matter what we bet. So we don't really need to overbet just to make sure we get value from weaker hands. Our opponent will not have much of a raising range against our overbetting range, so we also get less money from bluffs. Why raise if your opponent is representing sets in air? That's kind of going to be our opponent's thought process if we overbet him on this flop. Once we overbet him, he's probably going to think to himself, okay, an overbet means my opponent's representing a really, really polarized range, so then now raising will become less effective for me. So because of that, when we do overbet our strong hands, we might just make our opponent fold an air hand that would have bluff raised if we bet smaller, which just ends up costing us value. So for these reasons, overbetting is just not going to be all that effective here. In other words, overbetting isn't very effective here since we're still beat reasonably often with our pretty strong hands, jacks and better, and if we have them cold, we're going to stack them anyways. So once again, did we prove we shouldn't have an overbetting range on this flop? No, but here's just a list of reasons which show you it's not that good, in my opinion at least. It probably is a very easy sell when I show you other spots where I'm like, overbetting makes a ton of sense here. Everyone that's watching probably agrees. They think, okay, that makes sense. I should consider incorporating that into my game. Right here, it's probably not a very hard sell to show you why overbetting just isn't all that good. Complex hand example number 1, slide 4. Why shouldn't we bet very small here? So this one's a little bit more difficult, but think for a moment about what types of hands want to bet very small. Usually when we bet small, we need to mostly be betting for value since we must fall through or check the best hand on the turn at a high frequency. Remember, when we bet small, we give our opponent an awesome price, so we have to have value more often. Small bets force the opponent to felt wide and are most effective with weaker value hands since strong hands want to bet bigger. Okay, nothing too new there. We've already talked about that a bit. But what is the problem with betting something like a quarter of the pot here? Well, hands which want to bet very small also are the same hands that hate giving free cards. Since larger bets make some high equity hands fold, this encourages us to bet larger than we otherwise would if there weren't additional cards to come. So remember, on the river, we can get fancy and make those really small river bets because we're not worried about our opponent just seeing another card with his entire range. Here, the hands that want to bet small, like let's say pocket nines on this 10-8-5 board, pocket nines are like, okay, well I do want to bet small to make the opponent call with his eights, so I still get a good amount of value. If I bet small on the flop, I can get, multiple streets of value from eights. The problem is when I bet nines really small, I also let my opponent see the turn with a lot of hands that I wanted to make fold. Slide number 5. Now, before moving on, some of you might be thinking, well, do you think we should use multiple bet sizes here? We've talked about this a lot, and we're going to keep talking about it because it's a big deal. Yes, I do. I don't see how we wouldn't want multiple ranges here where each range is balanced. There are 2 reasons, however, why I would not use multiple bet sizes here in practice. The first is, I don't think in theory there'll be a very wide spectrum of theoretically correct sizes. In other words, maybe in theory we should have a balanced bet sizing ranges which involve betting anywhere between 0.55 pot size bets and 0.75 pot size bets. But since these sizings are close, the difference in EV won't be very large. So I've already explained why I don't like overbetting. I've already explained why I don't like betting very small. So I think there's a relatively narrow range of sizings which are going to be good. So since there's this narrow range of sizings which is good, it's not that big a deal if you're slightly off or if you pick just one size fits all sizing, because I don't think overall we're going to deviate much from around, 0.6 or 0.7 pot size bets here. Number 2, it is straight up just beyond my skill level to balance multiple sizes on the flop in this spot quickly at the time of making this video. Theory also has to be implemented. The EV of implementing multiple bet sizings on a board texture this tough doesn't seem worth it to me right now for where my game currently is. Maybe 5 years from now, if poker is legalized and I'm a grinder, I'll come back on this texture and start using multiple bet sizing ranges, but right now I'm not overly concerned with it. I'd rather just work on other aspects of my game right now. So, in these videos we usually only talk theory, because for the most part the theory that we've talked about I don't think is impossibly hard to implement. It's one of those things which is, yeah, it might not be easy to do at first. Some stuff's very easy to do like fix preflop, some stuff's much more difficult to do like balance out of position ranges on the flop. But for the most part, I don't think it's all that incredibly difficult to do. Right here, this is something that'd be really tough to do and probably not have a huge impact on your EV. So if you're watching this video and you're already really, really good at poker, okay, maybe this is something you want to work on, where you start looking at flop textures and balance multiple bet sizing ranges on a board texture like this. But for me, there's already enough other things that I could work on. To be honest, just about everyone watching this video, there's probably enough other stuff you can work on where this wouldn't be a huge concern because the EV difference doesn't seem huge and it's also going to be something that's quite difficult to implement. So remember, theory has to be implemented, so only really focus on it if you think it's worth your time and energy. Here, I don't think this one's overly important. We're going to go over a bunch of other bet sizing spots that it's much easier to implement multiple bet sizings and it's also much more important. So do what your skill level you think will allow you to do. Slide 6. The results of both wanting to bet to make high equity hands fold and to get value from worse hands results in us value betting many different types of hands here. I almost don't even like the term value betting anymore. It works great on the river, but is too vague for pre-flop and the flop if you're talking with other good players. Okay, so I know I'm going to use the term value betting in future videos. It's a term that we need to use when we're talking about different types of hands on the flop or for 3-betting pre-flop. But what I mean by this is realize how the term value bet doesn't really work perfectly on the flop and on the turn because you can be value betting for different reasons. Maybe I'm value betting a hand that's kind of weak because I want to make my opponent fold high equity hands. Maybe I'm value betting a hand that's absolutely nutted and I'm just doing it to get value. On the river, we're not going to have that problem. Because on the river, since there's no more additional cards to come, it's either going to be a value bet or a bluff because we're not trying to make our opponent fold any high equity hands. And we also don't have to deal with the fact that, maybe on the flop we can be betting a really strong draw, which also doesn't classify well as a value bet or a bluff. So I'm still going to use the term value betting in future videos, but understand why it doesn't work perfectly on the flop and pre-flop or even the turn. And just be sure you understand all the things that are going into making a hand, a bet or a check. It's a complex thing. You don't want to assign a label to a hand that isn't going to be helpful. So, what is my reasoning for betting the following hands if I do bet them? Pocket nines. So remember the board was 10-8-5 with a flush draw. Why am I betting pocket nines? I want to make my opponent fold some overcards on the flop, and I may get additional value from him when he calls with an 8 and checks down. Besides, he can only bet the turn so much when I check to him, or else my check raises will crush him. This sounds really reasonable to me. This is my thought process, so I would hope it sounds reasonable, but if I bet nines on the 10-8-5 board with a flush draw and I make my opponent fold king, queen, or king, jack, awesome. Those hands have like 25 or 27% equity. I'm glad he mucked them. I'm totally fine with making him fold the worst hand. If I make him call with 8s, then he checks back the turn, also awesome. Got additional value. If I bet the flop and I check to him on the turn and he bets, that kind of sucks. But he can only do it so often, so overall, I think I like value betting nines here. See, I just used the term value betting again, and it doesn't work great. Overall, I like betting nines on the flop and understanding all the details of why I like a bet. Now, what if I have pocket kings? Well, I just want to bet it for value. My hand isn't really vulnerable to hands in the opponent's folding range, but it's not strong enough to check raise, and I want my opponent to call with all of his jacks, 10x floats that would check back. So when I say jack, 10x floats that would check back, I don't mean he's checking back all of those hands. I just mean he will check them back some of the time, and I want to make sure I get value from them. He'll probably never check back jacks, but he'll definitely check back some 10x and some hands that would have floated. So kings is just a pretty clear value bet, and it's important to remember that when I say my hand isn't really vulnerable, I don't mean my opponent's not going to outdraw me with his flush draws and straight draws. I mean hands in the opponent's folding range, I'm not really vulnerable against. Pocket nines, when I make my opponent fold king, queen, and king, jack, I was very vulnerable to those hands. With pocket kings, if I make my opponent fold king, queen, and king, jack, I'm not vulnerable to those hands. I'm still vulnerable to flushes and straight draws, but those, unfortunately, aren't going anywhere no matter what I do. So, such is life. That's not what I'm talking about when I say we make high equity hands fold. Slide 7. While it may be obvious that you were betting nines mostly to make high equity hands fold, since check calling here is far from ideal for this very reason, and it may be obvious that you were betting kings mostly to get value from worse, don't think a hand must be betting only for one of two reasons. Some hands will have both qualities when bet on the flop, and these hands usually make the clearest flop bets. For example, let's take pocket jacks. If we make our opponent fold king, queen off when we bet, that's pretty nifty since it had 25% or so equity against our hand. If we get value from 10x, 9s, or 8x, that also works. We're betting for both reasons. So this bet sizing series is going to tie in very, very heavily to the out of position flop play series. And one thing that's usually going to be a trend is if you have a betting range, the hands that kind of make the most obvious flop bets are usually going to be hands that both want to get value from worse and want to make high equity hands fold. It's not always going to be one or the other, but usually if you want a starting point, if you see a hand is both vulnerable and strong and wants value, like pocket jacks on a 10 high board, that's usually going to be a hand that's almost always going to be betting out of position. And just one last time so no one can get confused, even if you're making high equity hands fold and getting value from worse, if it overall doesn't make sense with your range to be betting, such as if you're out of position on the flop and your range is capped way, way too low, then you're still not going to be able to bet. But usually hands that make high equity hands fold and get value from worse make the best candidates for hands to bet on the flop. Situations can get very complex, so we don't want to needlessly label hands and make situations out to be simpler than they are. Nevertheless, understanding why we bet hands on the flop will be critical for understanding what bet sizing we should be using on various turns. So again, we're dealing with stuff that doesn't model particularly well, so just be aware of that. Slide 8. So we're sticking with the same situation we've just been talking about. It's the same hand example. So we're in the cutoff and our opponent's in the button. So let's say we bet the flop and our opponent calls. Our exact range isn't important here, so this will still apply even if you're using ranges that are different than mine. The turn card comes 2 of diamonds, making the board 10 of hearts, 8 of hearts, 5 of clubs, 2 of diamonds. The pot is now 20 big blinds, and we have around 90 big blinds up behind. What bet sizing makes sense for our range? Pause for a moment and think before going to the next slide. You want to train your brain to think better, so just pause if you can without going right to the next thing where I tell you. Slide 9. If you've seen a bunch of my videos already, you probably said we should overbet here. This makes a lot of sense for several reasons. The first is, it is extremely unlikely our opponent has us beat on the turn. Probably the most important one, right? He'd have to slow play a hand on the flop, which is really hard to do, and then if he didn't slow play a strong hand on the flop, there's no way the turn card could have improved him. And our opponent won't really want to slow play on this flop since there aren't many blank turns. We happen to just get really lucky and get a turn card that's very good for our range. If our opponent does think we're overbetting a lot on the turn and decide to start slow playing, that's very risky, so there's really not a good option for our opponent here. Overbetting just in theory makes a lot of sense. Many of our hands are also still vulnerable and can be outdrawn by the river. Queens and kings are a good example of this. There's still a lot of straight draws and flush draws our opponents can have, and as our overpairs get worse, like pocket queens, our opponent's going to have some overcards in addition to the flush draw he has sometimes. Number 3, our opponent will not raise our turn bet almost ever. If we want to get a lot of value from the best hands in the opponent's range, we have to bet big now. This is very key, we talked about it earlier, but you can kind of bet smaller if your opponent's going to raise you a lot, because then you don't end up losing value from the strongest hands in your opponent's range. Here, the strongest hands in our opponent's range are going to be like jacks and ace-10, and those aren't raising us if we bet small, so if we want to get value from them, we need to bet big now. This is honestly about as easy of an overbet spot as they come, so we're going to randomly generate flops and textures and spots later on. I'm intentionally picking the easy ones now, so this might have been a really obvious one to you if you've seen a lot of my videos before, but that's done on purpose. It's a really easy overbet spot. Slide 10. But wait. While value overbetting worked very well for our very strong hands, and obviously we balanced that out with air, what about the weaker hands that bet the flop? You know, the ones that were mostly betting because they couldn't be check called very effectively and we wanted to make high equity hands fold. So this is the component we kind of ignore a lot when we talk about overbetting. We don't talk about, well, what do we do when we don't have those really strong hands, because those are the tricky ones. Overbetting with a hand like 9s, Queen 10, Jack 10 sucks worse than Napoleon Dynamite and Grand Torino combined. In other words, it's almost as bad as Lost in Translation. We only get called by hands that beat us and make all the hands we want to get value from fold. So we know already that even though overbetting makes a lot of sense with a group of hands, if we overbet everything in our flop betting range on the turn, it's going to be absolutely terrible. It's going to be a disaster. We can't do that, so we're going to have to use multiple bet sizing. We need to develop another range that utilizes a smaller bet sizing, so each range will be balanced, and we're mostly putting all our hands in the range that they play best in. Let me try to clarify really quickly what I just said before moving on. It's going to become a lot clearer in the future slides. But what I mean by mostly putting hands in the bet sizing range that they play best in, I mean, we're usually going to be taking sort of the obvious line with the obvious hands. So we overbet our really strong hands, for example, and then we bet smaller with a range that consists of mostly weaker value hands. But we also might need to sometimes put a hand in a different range because it's more profitable to do that and be tricky once in a while. Or we might need to sort of balance out a range. Like even if flush draws on the turn might play better as overbets, if we only overbet our flush draws, then our small betting range is very, very vulnerable when the flush comes on the river. So that's what I meant by when we mostly put the right hands in sort of their ideal ranges. That'll become clearer as we go over the next few slides. And if you're playing any SSNL game and you're not deep, you should always jam no matter how bad the spot is, if it's either jamming in a terrible spot or watching Lost in Translation. That movie sucks. Alright, let's talk small out-of-position bets for a few. Let me start with asking you a simple question. What is the difference between betting one big blind or 5% of the pot on a 10-8-5-2 turn and checking? So remember, the pot's 20 big blinds, and I'm just asking you, pause for a moment and think, practically, what's the difference between if I bet one big blind to you on this flop or if I check? there really isn't much of a difference. You didn't reopen up the betting like a small bet in position would, and betting so small and checking are effectively the same thing. We have a tendency to think something huge happens when we bet, but this isn't the case here. So if you or me are playing out of position on the turn, it doesn't really matter if we decide to bet really small or check. It's pretty much effectively the same thing, right? And a lot of the times people sort of will know that. They treat a really small bet from a fish very similar to the way they treat a check, because there really just isn't that big of a difference. If there's $20 in the pot, whether or not I bet $1 or whether or not I check, it doesn't really matter if I'm out of position because I don't reopen up the betting. This, of course, isn't true if I'm in position, because when I'm in position, I give my opponent the opportunity to check raise me. Another thing which kind of makes this easier to visualize for me is imagine checking out of position as the same thing as betting $0. The difference between betting $0 or betting $1 when the pot's already $20 just really isn't a big deal. This is very different from something like min-raising in position, since we would now be putting in twice as much money into the pot and be reopening the betting. Yet a min out of position bet here of 1 BB is almost no different than checking. So just keep that in mind. A min raise, which also is a line that maybe people associate with being a fish sometimes, but a min raise is hugely different from a min bet out of position, because a min raise requires you putting in twice as much money, and it reopens up the betting if you're in position. Whereas just a min bet out of position, it really just doesn't do anything. So let's continue on to slide 11 for that hand example. What if we decided to bet the turn quite small with hands that were originally betting the flop largely to make high equity hands fold? While it's true we'll often be checking nines on most turn cards, we didn't get a most turn card here. We got the 2 of diamonds, which is a phenomenally good card for our range, so we can bet at a higher frequency. So on the flop, I was betting nines, and I wasn't really sure exactly what I was going to do on the turn because so many different turn cards could come. But now that I got a really good turn card, I want to entertain the idea of betting small with nines, because overall I can bet at a higher frequency because the turn card was very good for my range, and my opponent's not going to have me beat on the turn all that often. In other words, why not bet small with hands like 10x and 9s? Betting small will do the following. It will get more value from 8x hands, or in the case of, a strong 10, it will get more value from weaker 10x hands and pocket 9s. It will make us lose less when we are behind and the opponent just calls our bet. So if we check and our opponent bets big and we check call, we're losing more than if we just bet small ourselves and our opponent doesn't raise us. And we still charge the opponent to see an additional card when he has a gut shot and or overcards. We no longer let our opponent realize his equity with these hands for free. That's very key. Our opponent's equity has probably gone down on the turn. Remember, we got a good card for our turn. We got a good card for our range on the turn. So now our opponent, when he has a hand like, ace queen or queen king with some backdoor flush draws, his equity was pretty much close to halved, right? He just completely whiffed on one of his 2 opportunities. So now we can bet smaller and say to ourselves, okay, it's still going to be very difficult for our opponent to call. We're still charging him to realize his equity, but his equity is smaller now than it was on the flop with a lot of these overcard hands. So now I want to go back to talking small out of position bets in general, and then we'll move on with the hand. So I don't want to get too involved with the concept of making very small bets at the moment, but hopefully you can see the following. The first is betting very small and checking out of position aren't functionally very different. Make sure you really absorb this, because it can be one of those sort of mental leaks you can have, how everyone, or I don't want to say everyone, a lot of people always check to the preflop raiser or always c-bet as a preflop raiser, even though it doesn't really make sense. They think there's this rule there that doesn't exist. So make sure you just really understand that checking and betting small aren't functionally very different. Betting small makes the most sense with a range that is condensed and doesn't want to give free cards. That makes sense, right? When you're betting a really small amount, you're usually betting hands that aren't very strong, so it's mostly in a part of a condensed range. And you also don't want to give free cards. You want to charge your opponent for his ability to realize his equity. And if the opponent has a weak but not terrible hand, he will probably be able to make a slightly plus EV call against our very small bet. But if we just check to him, he'd be able to make a more substantial plus EV check back. Remember, just because a small bet and check both give the opponent plus EV opportunities does not suggest one line won't have a higher EV for the opponent. I'd rather give my opponent a plus 1.1 EV big blind call rather than a plus 2.8 EV big blind check back. This is probably a confusing last part to think about, so let me just talk about it for a second. A lot of times people, when they're talking or thinking theory, imagine there's all these points where they make their opponent indifferent to calling or folding. That works really well on the river when you have a bluff catcher and you're facing the exact frequency of value bets and bluffs that you're indifferent to calling. That doesn't really work that well on the flop. You're usually only going to be indifferent with maybe one exact hand. And it also doesn't really work that well on the turn for the same reason. There's an additional card to come. So what I'm saying is, a lot of people might think, oh, I don't like betting small with, 10x on the turn or 9s on the turn, because my opponent can still call profitably with his flush draws or his straight draws or his gut shot with 2 overcards and stuff like that. And that's probably true. But it might give your opponent a less plus EV call than if we were to have just checked ourselves. Because if we check and our opponent checks back and he gets to realize all of his equity for free with his overcards, the EV might be 2.8 big blinds. Whereas if we make a bet that's like 35 or 40% of the pot, yeah, our opponent can probably still make a profitable call, but it might be less profitable than if we were to have checked to him. So I know we're kind of just glossing over this right now, but make sure you really understand this. You're not just trying to make your opponent indifferent with all these hands. It's also pretty good if you say, okay, well, he can still, profitably see the river, but now he's seeing the river less profitably because we did bet the turn small. Slide 12. Can you think of a problem that arises when we bet small with a range of 10x, 9s, and air? It's a pretty easy one to find. Pause for a moment and try to find the problem on your own, but it should just pop out immediately. What's the problem with that range? The opponent can start raising us with any hand stronger than 10x, which in this case includes jacks and ace 10, right? Because if he raises ace 10, he knows he's at least splitting. He's never behind. Our range has become transparent and is now capped too low. How do we fix this? We add some very strong hands into our range. So, we're still going to use 2 bet sizing ranges here. But now we're thinking to ourselves, okay, we can clearly see how if we have a very capped small betting range, that clearly is a problem. Our opponent can raise his way too aggressively. So now we just need to go out of our way and fix the small betting range, whereas the over betting range is already just perfect. There's nothing we have to worry about if we're betting nuts and air, but since now we're dealing with a small betting range where we don't just have nuts and air, we need to make sure it's balanced and has everything in it that it needs. So now on slide 13, we're just going to sort of illustrate what happens here. Imagine if we never put any very strong hands in our small betting range. What does our opponent do? Okay, so if we never bet any really strong hands small, he will raise us very aggressively with ace 10 and jacks and a whole bunch of bluffs. We just talked about that, nothing new there. Now imagine what happens if we put nearly all our very strong hands in our small betting range. What does our opponent do? So for example, let's just imagine we only had a 1 bet sizing range on the turn and we bet small. What would our opponent do when he faced this bet? He would never raise us. Raising a range capped at jacks and ace 10 is very ineffective when we are betting with many hands which are stronger. Right, remember our opponent's range is capped on the turn. So now all we're trying to do is making sure we don't have a flop betting range which is small and even more capped. So if we bet our entire range small on the turn, our opponent would never be able to raise because he's running into way too many sets and 2 pair and over pairs to ever raise against our small betting range if we bet all of our strong hands small. Quite simply, we need to put enough strong hands in our small betting range that our opponent will raise often enough to make the EV of betting the nuts small equal the EV of betting the nuts big. So, if I'm saying I think we should bet the nutted hands big sometimes and small sometimes, I am by definition saying the EV must be equal. Because if the EV wasn't equal, I would always take the more plus EV line. And if I'm telling you, no, wait a second, you should bet, your 2 pair small sometimes and then big sometimes, then by definition, the EV must be the same. So our opponent has to be taking a line that makes the EV of us betting big and betting small equal. So what that means is, if our opponent's never raising our small bets, we're just going to overbet all our nutted hands because we're saying, hey, you know what? I'm not going to bet my nutted hand small because my opponent doesn't raise me often enough to make it worth it. I get more value by betting big. That's what strong hands like to do. They like to bet big. So if my opponent's not raising, I'm just not going to bet any of my strong hands small. If he raises our small bets too much, we'll just bet all of our nutted hands small because then we know, hey, our opponent is raising us too aggressively. So we're actually getting more value by betting small because our opponent's raising us so much than the value we get from betting big. So pretty obvious exploitative play here. So slide 14 is a wall of text, so get excited. You should be able to see how an equilibrium will form here between 2 strong players. We add enough nutted hands in our small betting range so our opponent will be close to indifferent to value raising or calling our small bets with ace 10 and jacks. Our opponent raises our small bets enough so that we will be close to indifferent to betting small and overbetting nutted hands. So again, this is what happens when an equilibrium forms. If we're both at an equilibrium, then that means we don't really care whether or not we bet our nutted hands big or small if the EV is the same. Our opponent doesn't really care whether or not he raises ace 10 or jacks or calls with them, the EV is the same. Now, if one of us isn't using the appropriate frequencies, then it gives the other player an opportunity to exploit him. So for example, if our opponent notices we're not betting any nutted hands small, he can start raising us aggressively. If we start noticing our opponent's almost never raising us with ace 10 or jacks when we bet small, then we don't need to bet any nutted hands small. So we still need to each, be using the right frequencies to remain at that equilibrium, but if we are at that equilibrium, the EV between us betting big or small with the nuts will be the same. Remember, this is not my way of saying I think this equilibrium will form in practice. I am simply saying that this is what theory has led me to believe should conceptually make sense here. In reality, overbet bluff too much if your opponent folds too much, or overbet for value too much if he calls too much. Figure out how your opponent responds to small bets. If he lacks the testicular fortitude to raise ace 10 and jacks for value, then don't put nutted hands in your small betting range without a good reason. So, honestly, I'm sure people that play all sorts of different stakes watch these videos. I don't know exactly how people are going to respond to small bets on the site you play, at the stake you play, and how you as a player play. You're probably going to have to go figure it out. Your job isn't to be a theory smith for the sake of making theory, but by understanding theory well, you'll know what lines are incredibly effective against anyone, if balanced, and then you can then go from there to see what works best against your opponent. So this is something that I really want to make super clear. Theory is usually incredibly good at giving you a great starting point, and from there, you can check your own thought process to make sure you don't have any contradictions in your thought process to see what will let you exploit your opponent best. So, if someone were, for example, to say, oh, I don't like theory, I think it's bullcrap, all that kind of stuff, they need to give me a good reason for why they're never overbetting this turn. Because theory is telling me that overbetting this turn all the time is going to make a lot of sense. They need to give me a good reason for why they're never betting small on this turn. Because theory all the time is going to tell me that betting small makes sense here. Usually the players that hate on theory don't have a good reason for why they wouldn't overbet here or why they wouldn't bet small here. It's not like they tried it out and figured out like, well, even though it makes sense in theory, exploitatively it's bad. It's more of just like a laziness thing. With, as I said, there are a few exceptions, but it's more of just like a laziness thing, whereas once you start sort of opening up that can of worms where you start really approaching all these different bet sizings and have to learn the theory behind why each bet sizing makes sense, it's hard, and a lot of people would rather just prefer to pretend the theory doesn't exist so they can just keep always betting 0.65 pot size bets. So, don't do theory for the sake of doing theory, but it will be very useful for giving you a good starting point to know what is likely going to make the most sense if you're playing against a good opponent. Slide 15. So now we have two bet sizing ranges on the turn. An overbetting range designed to maximize the value we get with our strong hands against our opponent's jacks and ace 10 hands. So remember, if we're overbetting on the turn, I know we haven't approached the river yet, but even just a turn overbet, it's going to mean the opponent's going to be felting a very strong range. So when we overbet the turn, and if we make another big bet on the river, we don't expect our opponent to felt very wide, so we're mostly going to be getting value from these type of hands. Whether or not our opponent felts, king 10 suited or queen 10 suited will probably depend on how many like ace 10 combos he can have. If he has ace 10 off, maybe he'll just felt ace 10 and jacks. If he doesn't have ace 10 off, maybe he'll have to felt wider. But an overbetting range is designed to maximize the overall value we get, and that's accomplished by, value stacking his strongest hands in his range. Number two, a small betting range, designed to prevent the opponent from getting to see free cards while keeping the opponent's range wide to still get value from 9s and 8x type hands. So that's incredibly important to note. When we were betting small on the turn, we can kind of hit a sweet spot where we're still charging our opponent to, outdraw us when he has overcards, and we're still getting value from the hands we want to get value from. So if we bet pocket 9 small, maybe we can get king queen to fold and 8x to call. That's awesome. Should we only have two bet sizing ranges in theory here? So pause and ask yourself. No, there should be many more bet sizing ranges, but using two bet sizing ranges is a lot better than using one. Do what you think you're capable of. So personally, I like to go with 2. If you think you can do more than 2, then you get a gold star, but I think the vast majority of people will probably find 2 good enough here. Slide 16. Now imagine we decide to use two bet sizing ranges on the turn. For one sizing, we go 1.15 pot size bets, and for the other, we go 0.4 pot size bets. So we have the small bet sizing and the large bet sizing. Note with these sizings, the opponent cannot expect us to put a lot of money in the pot on the turn if he slow plays the flop, despite how risky it is. While he may pick off an overbet by slow playing, we also might just make a really small bet. We're not overbetting recklessly, so he likely still wants to usually raise 2-pair plus on the flop. And remember, we're not even always going to get a card that we can overbet on the turn. Usually we're going to get a turn card where overbetting isn't that good. Note the average bet size most people make on the turn here is about 0.7 pot size bets. So obviously this will be a little different based on the games and the stake you're playing, but that's the usual sizing that people tend to go to. If I had to pick one sizing, that might be good, but is that really very effective for many or any hands in our range? So think about this for a minute. Most people that are watching this video probably bet around 2/3 of the pot on the turn. What hands does 2/3 of the pot work best with? Think for a minute. Because personally, I don't think it's very good. Maybe it works for something like jacks. I haven't done the math for it. We'll do this later in the series. But overall, I don't think this sizing is very good. The bet is too small for our premium hands and too large for our hands which we're betting on the flop to deny the opponent the ability to realize his equity. It just doesn't seem that great here with very many hands. So I really want to stress how important this is. If someone told me right now, I have to pick a bet sizing that I will always use when I'm out of position on the turn after betting the flop, if I do decide to bet the turn, then something like 0.75 pot size bets might be pretty good. It's not, a huge bet, yet it's also not a very small bet that's giving my opponent a great price. So if I had to pick a sort of one-size-fits-all, 0.7 pot size bets might work pretty well. But once I get into the fact that I can balance multiple ranges, I actually think 0.7 pot size bets isn't really that effective. If we were betting a hand on the flop mostly for value, like an overpair, it's probably going to be able to overbet the turn, and that's going to be the most effective way to play it. If we were betting the flop kind of to make high equity hands fold, then betting 0.7 pot size bets on the turn really isn't going to be that effective. If I bet the flop with 10 jack or pocket nines, I'm now betting so big if I bet 0.7 pot size bets that my opponent's just not going to end up felting worse, so it's not going to really work out that well. And I also don't need to bet that big to deny him the ability to realize his equity with overcards effectively. So it's very interesting to me that it's like the sizing that most people use here works pretty well as a one-size-fits-all. But once you start saying, hey, let's make 2 bet sizing ranges, or let's make 3 bet sizing ranges, you might even find that 0.7 pot size bets just doesn't really work at all. It still might work for a few hands, like it might work for jacks or ace 10. As I said, I haven't done the math for that yet. But overall, I don't think it's one of the more effective sizes. Obviously, when we do other board textures, we might find that 0.7 pot size bets works great. We're going to have to adjust our bet sizing based on the situation. Slide 17. Note we use both an ascending and descending bet sizing structure here. Why did they both make sense? So that seems kind of odd, right? We know when to use an ascending bet sizing structure. We know when to use a descending bet sizing structure. We ended up using both here. How can they both make sense? Well, descending bet sizing made sense because our opponent's equity decreased when he held overcards, gut shots, etc. Remember, his equity was almost halved when he had overcards, or around halved, because now he only has one chance to outdraw rather than 2. So that made a descending bet sizing make sense with those sort of medium strength hands we had, because we're now less concerned with making our opponent fold his high equity overcard hands. And ascending bet sizing made sense because we overbet a range which wanted to get a lot of money in the pot, and the opponent will almost never raise the turn. Both ascending and descending make sense here, which is why we had 2 ranges, and we put the right hands in each range. So in other words, our opponent's range became very condensed once he called the flop bet, and we were thus able to make a very polarized overbetting range on the turn. That doesn't mean we only wanted an overbetting range, because there were a lot of hands that did want to bet that overbetting didn't make sense with, but using an overbetting range that consists of just nutted hands and air, and then taking the right amount of nutted hands and putting them into the small betting range to balance it, seems like it's going to be really effective here. So we're going to wrap up this video with this image that I just made. So on the flop, we were using a single bet sizing because I already discussed why on this particular board texture, I wasn't really in love with overbetting or betting really small, so one size seemed to make sense. Then we spent most of our time talking about the first split, which happened on the turn where we made overbetting range and a small betting range. So we can use 2 bet sizings to overall increase our EV. And then in the next video, we're going to talk about where the second split occurs, which is on the river, where once we see the river card, we can once again we can have several bet sizing ranges. Maybe we'll have an overbetting range, a medium size betting range, and a small betting range. We can make the second split where we get to the river with a whole bunch of different sizings. So, thank you for watching the video, everyone. I will talk to you guys in the forums, and I will be making the third part relatively soon. Good luck at the tables, everyone. I'll see you later. Bye.